The common version of the Vietnam War says it was misunderstood, that the American public didn't grasp the complexity of the conflict, that the soldiers were failed by the people back home, that the strategy was sound, but the politics were broken. That version has been repeated so many times it has developed the texture of fact. But misunderstood implies there was something true underneath, something that could have been understood if only people had tried harder or paid better attention. The more accurate word is misrepresented. Not confused but deliberately shaped. Not obscured by complexity but obscured by design. The difference matters because one version asks you to feel sympathy for the people who ran the war, and the other asks you to look more carefully at what they were actually doing. Vietnam was a war that generated enormous quantities of paper, reports, assessments, projections, after-action reviews, body count summaries, strategic evaluations, progress metrics. The paper moved constantly. It traveled up chains of command and across oceans and into briefing rooms where men in pressed uniforms presented it to other men in pressed uniforms, and the numbers on that paper bore very little relationship to what was happening on the ground in the Mekong Delta or the Central Highlands or the narrow strip of coastline where soldiers were being rotated in and out on 12-month tours. The war on paper and the war in the mud were not the same war. They shared a geography and a timeline, but almost nothing else. This is not a story about individual soldiers who did terrible things and then came home and couldn't talk about it. That story has been told, and it is true, and it matters. But it is also a smaller story than the one that actually happened. The story that actually happened is about institutions, about systems, about the way an entire military and political apparatus constructed a version of reality that served its own continuation, and then defended that version against all evidence to the contrary for years, while men died in numbers that were never accurately reported and for objectives that were never honestly defined. The war began, for American forces in any serious operational sense, without a declaration. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed in August of 1964 following reported attacks on American naval vessels, gave President Johnson the authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal congressional declaration of war. The second attack, the one that prompted the resolution, almost certainly did not happen. The signal's intelligence was ambiguous. The commander on the scene, Admiral James Stockdale, who was flying overhead during the alleged incident, said he saw no North Vietnamese vessels and no torpedo wakes. The signals that suggested an attack were later assessed as likely misinterpretations of South Vietnamese radio traffic. This was known, or at least suspected, within days. The resolution passed anyway. The war that followed was built on that foundation. Escalation proceeded incrementally, which is itself a kind of deception. Each step was presented as a response to what had just happened, rather than as part of a plan, and each step made the next step easier to justify. By 1965, American combat troops were arriving in large numbers, and by 1966, the force structure had grown to several 100,000 personnel. The official explanation kept pace with the expansion. The war was being fought to contain communism. The war was being fought to honor treaty commitments. The war was being fought to demonstrate American resolve. The war was being fought to protect South Vietnamese democracy. These justifications did not stack neatly on top of each other. They contradicted each other in ways that senior officials noticed and chose not to address publicly. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under both Kennedy and Johnson, was a man who believed deeply in quantification. He had come from Ford Motor Company, where measurable outputs determined success, and he brought that framework to the Pentagon with complete confidence in its applicability. Every aspect of the war effort was subjected to metric analysis. Hamlets pacified, roads secured, weapons captured, defectors tallied, and most significantly, enemy killed. The body count became the central measure of progress in a war where territory could not serve that function, because territory that was taken one week was often lost the next. If you could not point to land held, you could at least point to numbers. The problem was that the numbers were false. Not occasionally false, not exaggerated at the margins, but systematically and structurally false in a way that everyone involved understood, and almost no one reported accurately. The pressure to produce high body counts flowed down the chain of command from the very top. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, had committed himself to a strategy of attrition. The idea was to kill enemy combatants faster than they could be replaced. This required demonstrating, regularly and numerically, that the killing was happening at a sufficient rate. Units that reported high body counts received praise. Units that reported low body counts were questioned. The incentive structure was clear. What followed was predictable. Soldiers reported killed combatants who were not combatants. They counted bodies that were not enemy soldiers. They reported kills based on blood trails and weapons found rather than confirmed deaths. They rounded numbers upward. Commanders added multipliers. Headquarters added their own adjustments. By the time a firefight in a rice paddy had been processed through the bureaucratic layers and arrived as a data point in a Washington briefing room, it bore almost no connection to what had actually occurred. Studies conducted after the war, including internal military analyses, concluded that the official enemy casualty figures were inflated by somewhere between 40 and 100%. The kill ratios that McNamara cited as evidence of progress were, in large part, artifacts of the system that was supposed to measure progress. This was not a secret within the military. Officers knew, soldiers knew, journalists embedded with units knew. The knowledge existed at every level of the institution, and the institution continued to operate as if the knowledge did not exist. Reporting what you actually saw, rather than what the system expected to see, carried professional consequences. There are documented cases of officers who submitted accurate reports and found their careers stalled, their assessments questioned, their credibility challenged by men who had never left their headquarters. The system had a strong immune response to accurate information. The Strategic Hamlet program offers a compressed version of this dynamic. Launched in 1962 under the Diem government with heavy American involvement and funding, the program aimed to relocate rural South Vietnamese into fortified villages, cutting the population off from Viet Cong influence and supply lines. On paper, the program expanded rapidly. Thousands of hamlets were reported as successfully established and pacified. The numbers were impressive and they were presented as evidence of progress. In practice, many of the hamlets existed only as entries in a ledger. Fortifications that had been reported as completed were unfinished or non-existent. Populations that had been reported as relocated had returned to their original villages. Hamlets that had been classified as secure were regularly infiltrated by Viet Cong cadres who had never been removed in the first place. South Vietnamese officials responsible for managing the program learned quickly that reporting success was rewarded and reporting failure was not, and they adjusted their reports accordingly. American advisors who knew the reality often sent it up through back channels or informal communications where it was generally ignored. The Strategic Hamlet program was officially a success until it was officially abandoned, and its failure was never formally acknowledged in the terms that would have required reassessing the broader strategy. The relationship between American advisors and South Vietnamese forces contained its own particular strains. American doctrine and American assumptions did not map cleanly onto a conflict that was simultaneously a civil war, a guerrilla campaign, a political contest, and a conventional military engagement. American officers arrived for their 12-month tours, many of them eager to demonstrate competence and to gain combat experience that would benefit their careers back home, and they applied American solutions to problems that did not respond to American solutions. The 12-month rotation itself was a structural problem that never received adequate official attention. An officer arrived, spent several months learning the operational environment, reached a period of relative effectiveness, and then rotated out just as that effectiveness was developing. His replacement started the learning process again. The institutional knowledge that might have accumulated over years of continuous engagement was constantly being reset. South Vietnamese commanders understood this cycle and adapted to it. They knew that an American advisor who had been in country for 2 months was unlikely to understand the local political dynamics well enough to challenge the information they were being given. They provided the information that maintained good relations with their American counterparts and preserved their own operational autonomy. This was not simply corruption, though corruption was also present. It was a rational response to an advisory relationship that had structural incentives pointing in the wrong direction. The tunnel systems beneath the Iron Triangle and the Q-Chi district represent something that the official narrative of American technological superiority took a long time to accommodate. Constructed over decades, beginning during the resistance against French colonial rule and expanded continuously through the American War, the tunnels ran for hundreds of kilometers and included command centers, hospitals, weapons caches, living quarters, and communication nodes. They allowed Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units to operate beneath areas that American forces believed they controlled. Units would disappear underground after an engagement and reappear miles away. Areas that had been subjected to massive bombing and defoliation continued to harbor active enemy forces because the forces were operating in a dimension that air power could not reach. American forces developed specialized units called tunnel rats who would enter the tunnels to clear them. These were among the most psychologically demanding assignments of the war. The tunnels were dark, narrow, booby-trapped, and occupied by enemy soldiers who had been living in them for months or years and knew every turning. Tunnel rats operated largely alone, without the unit cohesion that provided psychological structure for most combat assignments. They carried pistols rather than rifles because rifles were unmanageable in the confined space. They developed their own informal protocols for survival that were not covered in any training manual. Many of them reported that the experience of tunnel operations was categorically different from any other combat experience, not simply more dangerous, but differently structured at a psychological level, in a way that was difficult to translate to anyone who had not done it. The bombing campaigns present a case study in the distance between strategic intention and operational reality. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from 1965 to 1968, was designed to break Hanoi's will to continue the war and to interdict the flow of supplies and troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It failed to accomplish either objective. North Vietnamese air defense systems, supplied and in some cases staffed by Soviet and Chinese technicians, inflicted significant losses on American aircraft. The industrial and infrastructure targets that were struck were repaired or replaced faster than they could be destroyed. The bombing strengthened nationalist resolve rather than weakening it, as aerial bombardment of civilian populations has historically tended to do. The flow of supplies down the trail was disrupted, but not stopped. None of this was hidden from the analysts who were assessing the bombing campaign. The Central Intelligence Agency produced repeated assessments throughout Rolling Thunder's duration, concluding that the bombing was not achieving its intended effects. These assessments were received by the administration, noted, and set aside. The bombing continued because stopping it would have required acknowledging that the strategy was not working, and acknowledging that would have required asking what the strategy should be instead. And that question had answers that senior officials were not prepared to confront publicly. The campaign consumed enormous resources, killed a substantial number of North Vietnamese civilians, and ended without producing the outcomes it was designed to produce. The official assessment at the time was that it had contributed meaningfully to the broader effort. Agent Orange and the other herbicide compounds used under Operation Ranch Hand represent a category of reality that took decades to fully surface. The defoliation program began in 1961 and continued through 1971. Its stated purpose was to destroy the jungle canopy that provided cover for enemy movement and to eliminate food crops that supported enemy operations. Approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed over South Vietnam, along portions of Laos and Cambodia, and in some cases over populated areas. The active chemical in the most widely used compound, Agent Orange, included dioxin as a contaminant. Dioxin is among the most toxic substances produced by industrial processes and is associated with cancer, neurological damage, reproductive harm, and immune system disruption. American soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange throughout the conflict. They were sometimes sprayed directly while in the field. They operated in areas that had been recently treated. They used empty drums that had contained the compound to burn waste or to carry water. The military's official position for years was that the compound posed no significant health risk. Veterans who developed cancers and other conditions associated with dioxin exposure were told the connection was unproven. The Department of Veterans Affairs resisted recognizing Agent Orange exposure as service-connected for conditions that research was progressively linking to it. The process by which recognition was eventually extended, for some conditions and not others, took decades and required veterans to organize, document, litigate, and repeat their claims against an institution that had structural incentives to minimize its liability. The Vietnamese population, both in the south where the spraying occurred and in affected border regions, experienced the consequences on a larger scale and with less access to the bureaucratic mechanisms through which some American veterans eventually obtained acknowledgement. Studies conducted by Vietnamese researchers and international health organizations have documented elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other conditions in heavily sprayed areas, continuing into generations born after the war ended. The Agent Orange litigation involving Vietnamese plaintiffs in American courts was dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. The companies that produced the herbicides under government contract reached settlement agreements with American veterans in the 1980s without admitting liability. The Vietnamese government has sought compensation through diplomatic channels with limited results. Fragging, the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by enlisted soldiers, is one of the data points that most clearly indexes the deterioration of the American military's internal cohesion in Vietnam. The term derived from the fragmentation grenades that were sometimes used, though the phenomenon was not limited to that method. It was documented in official records, studied by military sociologists, and described in congressional testimony, and it represented something that the official narrative of military professionalism could not easily integrate. Between 1969 and 1972, the Army's own records documented over 500 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents resulting in death, and a significantly larger number of incidents that resulted in injury. The conditions that produced fragging were not difficult to identify. By the late 1960s, the rotation system had been in operation long enough that units were filled with soldiers who had no particular commitment to the mission, who had watched earlier cohorts of soldiers cycle through the war and come home, and were primarily focused on surviving their own tour. Orders to conduct operations that seemed pointless or unnecessarily dangerous were experienced not as military necessity, but as an imposition by officers who were managing their own career advancement at the expense of enlisted lives. The social contract that holds a military unit together under stress had frayed to the point where some soldiers found killing their own officers to be a rational option. The military handled fragging investigations with a combination of genuine effort and institutional self-protection. Cases that could be prosecuted were prosecuted, though convictions were difficult because witnesses were reluctant to testify and evidence was often ambiguous. Cases that could not be prosecuted were closed. The overall phenomenon was not publicly acknowledged at a level commensurate with its actual frequency. Officers who were known to have been killed by their own men were sometimes listed as having died in combat. The numbers that appeared in official statistics were almost certainly lower than the actual occurrence, because many incidents were not reported or were reported under different categories. The My Lai massacre in March of 1968 is one of the most documented events of the war, and also, in important ways, one of the most misrepresented. The documented facts are that soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, killed between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the hamlet of My Lai. The victims included women, children, and elderly men. There was no enemy contact during the operation. The killing went on for several hours. A helicopter crew, observing what was happening from the air, landed and interposed themselves between the soldiers and a group of civilians and reported the incident through their chain of command. The army investigated the incident and then suppressed the investigation for more than a year. The story was eventually broken not by internal reporting mechanisms, but by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who learned of it from a soldier who had written letters to multiple government officials without receiving any response. When the story became public in November of 1969, it produced a significant public reaction, though not the kind that produced immediate policy change. The official response focused on identifying the individuals responsible and prosecuting them, which served to frame the event as an aberration attributable to specific bad actors rather than as evidence of systemic problems. The broader context that the prosecution did not engage with was that My Lai was not categorically different from other operations that had been conducted throughout the war. The designation of free fire zones, areas in which anything that moved could be engaged as hostile, created conditions in which civilian deaths were routine and sanctioned. The distinction between combatants and civilians had collapsed in large parts of the operational area to the point where American units could not reliably make it. Rules of engagement that theoretically prohibited civilian casualties existed alongside operational pressures that made asking questions about civilian status professionally inconvenient. The soldiers at My Lai operated within a context that their training and their experience and their institutional environment had created. Prosecuting Lieutenant Calley while leaving that context unexamined was a form of resolution that did not actually resolve anything. Calley was convicted of premeditated murder in March of 1971. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. President Nixon ordered him released from the military prison at Fort Benning after 3 days and placed under house arrest pending appeal. He served 3.5 years of house arrest before his conviction was overturned on procedural grounds. He was the only person convicted in connection with My Lai. His commanding officer, Captain Ernest Medina, was acquitted. Officers higher in the chain of command were not charged. The Phoenix program operated in a different register from the conventional military operations that most histories of the war foreground. Launched formally in 1968 and run in part by the Central Intelligence Agency through its civil operations and rural development support structure, Phoenix was designed to neutralize the Viet Cong political infrastructure in South Vietnam. Neutralization was the official term, and it covered a range of activities including capture, defection, and killing. The program operated through a network of provincial reconnaissance units, district-level intelligence centers, and coordination mechanisms with South Vietnamese security forces. The program's internal accountability was poor, and the external accountability was minimal. Neutralization quotas were assigned to provinces and districts, and provincial officials who needed to meet their quotas had reliable methods for doing so that did not require accurately identifying members of the Viet Cong political apparatus. Personal enemies could be reported as Viet Cong. People with land or property that was coveted could be neutralized and their property transferred. Mistaken identity, which requires some basic level of investigative procedure to prevent, was common. The figures that Phoenix produced as evidence of its effectiveness, tens of thousands of Viet Cong neutralized over its operational period, reflected the same inflation dynamic that operated throughout the American war effort. William Colby, who ran the program and later became Director of Central Intelligence, testified before Congress in 1971 and defended Phoenix while acknowledging that it had operated outside normal legal structures. He maintained that it was a legitimate counterinsurgency tool and that its abuses, which he acknowledged, were not representative of its overall operation. Congressional criticism of the program was significant, but did not produce immediate termination. Phoenix continued operating, with modifications, until the end of the war. The question of what Phoenix actually accomplished strategically is genuinely contested among historians who have studied it carefully. The Viet Cong political infrastructure in South Vietnam was degraded, though the degree to which Phoenix, rather than military operations, was responsible, is difficult to isolate. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong continued to operate effectively throughout the Phoenix period and showed no evidence of having been strategically crippled by it. The political costs, in terms of what it communicated about the character of the government that was being defended and the methods of its American supporters, are harder to quantify, but were real. The heroin epidemic among American soldiers in Vietnam is a reality that received significant public attention in the early 1970s and then largely disappeared from the dominant narrative of the war. Studies conducted in 1971 found that somewhere between 20 and 25% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin, and that the majority of those who had used it had become physically dependent. The drug was cheap, potent, and readily available throughout the country. It arrived in forms that allowed soldiers to smoke it rather than inject it, which reduced the psychological barrier to use among men who did not think of themselves as drug users. The Army's initial response was a combination of denial and punitive enforcement. Soldiers identified as users faced discharge or prosecution, which created strong incentives not to seek treatment. A soldier with a heroin habit who wanted help had few options that did not carry significant professional consequences. The situation changed in 1971 when a combination of journalistic investigation and congressional pressure forced more honest accounting. Mandatory testing programs and treatment initiatives were implemented, but they operated within an institutional culture that had already been shaped by years of treating drug use primarily as a disciplinary problem. The follow-up research conducted on soldiers returning from Vietnam found that the majority of those who had been using heroin stopped using it after returning home. This finding was significant for what it suggested about the role of environment in addiction, that the conditions in Vietnam, the stress, the boredom, the moral confusion, the availability of the drug, were doing much of the causal work rather than simple pharmacological dependency. The finding was not widely integrated into the public discussion of the drug problem that was consuming political attention in the United States at the time, because it complicated the simple narrative about drugs and personal weakness that was more politically useful. The war's relationship to race and class at home was expressed in who fought and who did not. The draft that supplied the enlisted ranks with soldiers was riddled with deferment mechanisms that were accessible primarily to men from educated and economically comfortable backgrounds. College deferments kept men in school. Occupational deferments protected men in certain industries and professions. National Guard service, which during most of the Vietnam era did not result in deployment to Southeast Asia, was an option primarily available to men with connections to the National Guard units that had waiting lists. The men who fought in Vietnam were disproportionately working class, disproportionately from rural areas and small cities, and disproportionately young in the specific sense of not yet having acquired the social capital to navigate deferment systems. African American soldiers served in Vietnam at rates that were initially higher than their proportion of the American population because African American men had fewer deferment options and were more likely to be channeled into combat specialties. The military's official position was that this reflected colorblind standards being applied even-handedly, and that interpretation was contested from the beginning by civil rights organizations and African American soldiers themselves, who experienced the discrepancy as one more expression of structural inequality. After the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968, racial tension within American military units in Vietnam intensified substantially. There were incidents of racial violence at bases and aboard ships. There were informal segregation patterns within units. There was an atmosphere of mutual suspicion between white and black soldiers that official military culture had neither the tools nor the genuine motivation to address. The soldiers returning from Vietnam encountered a country that was not prepared to receive them in any coherent way. The processing centers that discharged them from military service were efficient at paperwork and poor at transition. A soldier could be in combat operations 1 week and in a civilian airport wearing civilian clothes 3 days later with no intermediate support structure of any kind. The psychological framework that military service had provided, the unit identity, the clear hierarchy, the defined purpose, evaporated almost instantly. Many veterans reported that the transition was so abrupt that it had a dissociating quality, as if the experience of the war was being categorically severed from the life they were supposed to resume. Post-traumatic stress, which would not be formally classified as a diagnostic category until 1980, existed throughout the veteran population under various informal descriptions and without institutional recognition. Veterans who sought help through the Veterans Administration encountered a system that was inadequately funded, primarily oriented toward the physical injuries of World War II veterans, and not equipped to provide the psychological support that Vietnam veterans needed. Mental health services were minimal. Staff were often unfamiliar with the specific character of Vietnam service. Veterans who described symptoms were often dismissed or medicated without any engagement with the underlying experience. The Tet Offensive of January and February of 1968 occupies a particular place in the history of the war's relationship to its own official narrative. It was a military failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in the sense that the objectives of capturing major South Vietnamese cities and triggering a popular uprising in the South were not achieved, and the attacking forces suffered very heavy casualties. It was a political catastrophe for the Johnson administration because it demonstrated, in real time and on American television, that the official assurances about the war's progress that had been given to the American public for years were false. The enemy that was supposed to be near defeat was conducting coordinated attacks on more than 100 targets simultaneously, including the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. The gap between what Americans had been told and what they were seeing was too large to paper over. Walter Cronkite's assessment, delivered in a special broadcast in February of 1968, that the war appeared to be mired in stalemate, carried particular weight not because Cronkite had access to information that others lacked, but because he had the cultural authority to say publicly what many people had privately concluded. Johnson decided not to seek re-election in March of that year. The decision was shaped by many factors, but the collapse of the credibility gap that Tet had accelerated was central to it. Nixon's approach to the war, which he had campaigned on under the description of a secret plan to achieve peace with honor, involved a combination of Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, and escalation in other dimensions. The bombing of Cambodia, which had been used by North Vietnam as a sanctuary and supply route, began secretly in March of 1969. The military falsified its records to conceal the bombing from Congress and from the public, using a dual reporting system in which actual targets were recorded internally, while official reports substituted false target locations. The falsification was known to the senior officers who oversaw it and to the civilian officials who authorized it. The secret bombing continued for 14 months before it became public. When it did, the response from the Nixon administration was to investigate the leak rather than to address the falsification. The administration's legal framework for the secret bombing rested on the president's authority as commander-in-chief, and that framework was never formally tested because the constitutional confrontation that might have tested it did not fully materialize. Congress eventually enacted legislation restricting the bombing, but the institutional precedent for falsifying military records to conceal operations from congressional oversight had been established and was not subsequently held accountable. The invasion of Cambodia in April and May of 1970, which Nixon announced publicly as a limited incursion against enemy sanctuaries, produced the largest domestic anti-war demonstrations of the conflict and triggered the killings at Kent State University, where Ohio National Guard troops fired into a crowd of student protesters, killing 4 people. The operational results of the Cambodia incursion were mixed. Enemy supplies were captured, and base areas were disrupted. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong simply moved their operations deeper into Cambodia. The incursion did not significantly alter the military trajectory of the war, but it substantially accelerated the domestic political trajectory toward withdrawal. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by former Defense Department analyst Daniel Ellsberg and published beginning in June of 1971, documented in internal government language what many observers had concluded from the outside. The papers showed that administration after administration had privately assessed the war's prospects as poor, while publicly describing progress and commitment. They showed that military options had been deliberately misrepresented to Congress. They showed that the bombing of North Vietnam had been expected from the beginning to be less effective than was publicly claimed. They showed that decision-makers knew, years before it became publicly visible, that the war was not being won and would not be won under the existing strategy, and continued it anyway. The Nixon administration's response was to seek an injunction preventing publication, framing it as a matter of national security. The Supreme Court ruled against the injunction in the Pentagon Papers case. The administration then pursued Ellsberg criminally. The case was eventually dismissed because it emerged that members of Nixon's White House, the same apparatus that would become prominent in the Watergate scandal, had conducted a break-in at the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in an attempt to find information that could be used to discredit him. The break-in was illegal, and the case was dismissed on grounds of government misconduct. Ellsberg was never convicted. The prisoners of war and those listed as missing in action represent a category of the war's legacy that continued to generate political energy long after the fighting stopped. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 included provisions for the return of prisoners of war. American prisoners held in North Vietnam were returned through Operation Homecoming in the months following the agreement. The question of whether North Vietnam had retained additional prisoners and whether men listed as missing in action were alive and being held generated substantial controversy throughout the 1970s and 1980s that had political dimensions that sometimes competed with factual ones. Congressional investigations, including the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, chaired by John Kerry in the early 1990s, examined the available evidence extensively and concluded that while there were unresolved cases and inadequate accounting from the Vietnamese government, the evidence did not support the conclusion that living American prisoners were being held in Vietnam after the war ended. The committee's conclusions were contested by some veterans and family members who remained convinced that men had been abandoned. The political potency of the POW and MIA issue sustained itself independent of the evidentiary conclusions because it touched something real about how the war had been conducted and how those who fought it had been treated by the institutions responsible for them. The fall of Saigon in April of 1975 was anticipated well enough in advance that American personnel and some South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces were evacuated. The evacuation itself, Operation Frequent Wind, was conducted under chaotic conditions as North Vietnamese forces advanced to the outskirts of the city. Images of helicopters taking off from rooftops while crowds of South Vietnamese who had been promised or implied protection were left behind became one of the iconic representations of how the war ended. The South Vietnamese government collapsed completely as North Vietnamese forces entered the city on April 30th. The South Vietnamese military, which had been the primary justification for Vietnamization and the years of continued American involvement that Vietnamization was supposed to make viable, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Units that were supposed to have been trained and equipped and developed to the point of self-sufficiency had fractured under the North Vietnamese offensive. The collapse suggested that the assessment of South Vietnamese military capacity that had underwritten Nixon's withdrawal strategy had been as inflated as every other metric that had been used to measure progress in the war. The gap between what the institution reported and what was actually true had followed the war all the way to its conclusion. The veterans who came home faced a country that was, for the most part, simply tired. Not hostile in the systematic way that later mythology would claim. The idea of veterans being universally spat upon is significantly exaggerated as a historical matter, but exhausted and eager to move past an episode that had cost enormously and produced nothing that could be described as a clear outcome. The political will to process what had happened. to examine honestly the decisions that had been made and the institutional failures that had occurred and the specific human costs that had been generated, was almost entirely absent. Investigations happened at the margins. Commissions were formed and produced reports that were not acted on. Films and memoirs and journalism engaged with the experience, but institutional accountability was minimal. The Veterans Administration remained underfunded and structurally inadequate for years after the war ended. The specific problems that Vietnam veterans experienced, the particular character of the psychological damage that came from that specific war, with its specific moral configurations, were slow to receive formal recognition. Agent Orange claims were contested for a decade and a half after the war. The formal diagnostic recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder in 1980 was an important development, but was not quickly matched by treatment capacity or institutional culture change. Veterans who had come home in the early and mid-1970s had spent years in a system that could not see what was wrong with them. The official history of the war, as it was written and rewritten in the years following, tended to foreground particular questions and leave others aside. The question of whether the war could have been won with different tactics or different political commitment received substantial attention. The question of whether it should have been fought and for what reasons received less. The institutional failures, the falsified body counts and suppressed reports and manipulated statistics and secret bombings and falsified records were documented and acknowledged at the level of historical record, while generating almost no institutional accountability at the level of the organizations and individuals responsible for them. The generals and senior officials who had presided over the systematic misrepresentation of the war's progress largely continued their careers, retired with honors, wrote memoirs that attributed failure to factors outside their control, and collected the institutional perquisites that the military provides to senior officers. Westmoreland sued CBS News for libel after a documentary alleged that he had deliberately suppressed accurate enemy strength estimates before the Tet Offensive. The suit was settled without a verdict, with CBS issuing a statement that fell short of retraction. The evidence presented during the litigation, including testimony from former military intelligence officers, substantially supported the documentary's core claims about the suppression of accurate enemy order of battle assessments. The war in the tunnels, the war in the statistics, the war in the briefing rooms, the war in the villages where Agent Orange fell and Phoenix teams arrived, the war in the units where officers were being killed by their own men, the war in the addiction clinics that did not exist yet, the war in the bodies of soldiers who did not know what they had been exposed to. All of these wars continued after the official war ended. They continued in the bodies of veterans who were dying of cancers associated with herbicide exposure while the government contested their claims. They continued in the psychological conditions that were not yet diagnosed, and the treatment facilities that were not yet funded, and the culture of silence that descends on institutions that have not honestly examined what they did. The Vietnamese dead numbered in the millions. North Vietnamese forces, South Vietnamese forces, Viet Cong, civilians in the south, civilians in the north who died in the bombing campaigns, Cambodians and Laotians who died in the operations that spilled across borders, refugees who died in flight. The precise number is not known and cannot be reconstructed from the records that exist, both because the record-keeping was inadequate and because some of the records that were kept were deliberately falsified. Estimates range widely depending on methodology. The American war dead numbered approximately 58,000. These are the names on the wall in Washington, and they are documented with a precision that reflects the difference between an institution's relationship to the deaths of its own members and its relationship to the deaths of those on the other side. The Hmong and other highland peoples of Laos, who had fought alongside American forces under CIA direction, were among those most thoroughly abandoned when the war ended. They had been recruited and armed and organized and led in operations that were conducted outside the boundaries of the official war and outside the scrutiny of the oversight mechanisms that nominally governed American operations. When the political decisions that ended American involvement were made, The commitments that had been made to these populations were not redeemed in any systematic way. Many fled into Thailand. Many were killed. The communities that had been built around the secret war were destroyed. The American officials who had run the operations retired or moved to other assignments. The environmental legacy of the war in Vietnam includes the herbicide contamination and also the unexploded ordnance that remains in the soil of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia decades after the fighting stopped. American bombing dropped more tonnage on Indochina than was dropped by all parties in the entire Second World War. A significant percentage of the ordnance that was dropped did not detonate. It remains in the ground, and it continues to kill and maim people, predominantly farmers and children, who encounter it in the course of ordinary activity. International efforts to clear unexploded ordnance from Laos, which received the heaviest bombing relative to its size of any country in history during the American War, have been ongoing for decades, and are expected to continue for many more. The debate over the war's meaning and its lessons, which began before the war was over and has never entirely stopped, has generated a specific kind of institutional forgetting that functions differently from ordinary forgetting. It is not that the events are unknown. They are documented in archives and libraries and congressional records and investigative journalism and academic histories and veterans' memoirs. The documentation exists. The forgetting operates at the level of institutional consequence, of policy change, of the integration of what was learned into how the institutions responsible for conducting wars actually function. In that dimension, the absorption has been incomplete in ways that subsequent conflicts have illustrated. The specific mechanisms that produced the Vietnam catastrophe, the pressure to produce metrics that demonstrated progress, the institutional punishment of accurate reporting, the gap between what senior officials said publicly and what they knew privately, the falsification of records, the extension of operations that were not achieving their stated objectives because stopping them would require acknowledging failure. All of these mechanisms have been documented and described and analyzed. The documentation did not prevent their recurrence. The analyses were read and filed, and eventually provided background for historians studying subsequent failures that bore a structural resemblance to the one being analyzed. A soldier who served in Vietnam during the period of maximum confusion, say 1968 through 1970, in a combat unit operating in the Central Highlands or the Mekong Delta, operated within a reality that their country's official accounts of the war did not describe. The enemy they faced was not near defeat. The strategic objectives they were serving were not clearly defined. The metrics being used to evaluate success were not measuring what they were claimed to measure. The support they would receive when they returned home was not adequate to what they had experienced. These facts were available to the institutional actors responsible for the war. The gap between what was known and what was said, and what was said and what was done, and what was done and what was acknowledged, runs through every dimension of the conflict like a structural fault. The last American combat units withdrew in 1973 following the Paris Peace Accords. The accords did not produce peace. Fighting between North Vietnamese forces and South Vietnamese forces continued at a lower intensity, with American air support increasingly constrained by congressional action until the final offensive of 1975. The war continued after American forces left because the conditions that produced it had not been altered by their presence. The South Vietnamese government that American intervention had been designed to preserve did not survive without American military support. It had never been able to survive without American military support, which was one of the things that the honest assessments filed through back channels throughout the war had consistently noted, and that the official assessments had consistently found ways to not say. The 58,000 names on the wall in Washington represent soldiers who died in service to objectives that their government did not define clearly, under commanders who reported what the institution wanted to hear rather than what was true, in a war that continued long after the people running it privately concluded it could not be won, in a country that has never fully accounted for what it did and what it failed to do, and what it knowingly allowed to happen, and what it told itself and its soldiers, and the world, while it was happening. In 1995, Robert McNamara published a memoir in which he said the war had been wrong, that he and others had been wrong, that the decisions made had led to enormous loss for no adequate purpose. The statement arrived 20 years after the fall of Saigon. He lived until 2009. Westmoreland died in 2005, maintaining until near the end that the war had been winnable. The soldiers who cleared tunnels with pistols in their hands, and the soldiers who became addicted to heroin, and the soldiers who came home to a system that could not see what was wrong with them, and the civilians who died in the free fire zones, and the villages that were burned, and the crops that were sprayed, and the children who were born into contaminated soil were not available to respond. On April 30th, 1975, at approximately 11:45 in the morning local time, a North Vietnamese tank drove through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The city had already been renamed. The war in Laos and Cambodia continued on somewhat different timelines. The unexploded bombs continued to sit in the soil of the Plain of Jars. The dioxin continued to move through the food chains of the Mekong Delta. The veterans continued to die of cancers that the government continued to dispute. The records that had been falsified remained in the archives, accurately reflecting only that they had been created.